Hi everyone, I'm Eleanor Maier and I've been working as a lexicographer on the OED for 16 years. I'll talk about user needs and user feedback. And many of the suggestions added have been added by editors in the course of their work. But we also look to our users for new word suggestions, and that's whether that's through targeted appeals for specific types of vocabulary, or as I mentioned, look at failed searches on the website, or from slips or online submissions that users have sent in. So that's just one of the ways in which the OED responds to user needs and user feedback. But another is customer usage on OED.com. We can look at patterns of usage and search things that people are searching for and looking up. And that helps us to prioritize which words to revise sooner rather than later. So the example on the slide is the entry for ekphrasis, which is a literary term. And we saw this was looked up a lot, and particularly around the start of the academic year, maybe because tutors were asking their students to write an essay about, I don't know, ekphrasis in Virgil, for example. And so it seemed like a really good candidate for revision, both because the definition isn't particularly helpful. It's asking the user to see a quotation, which is from the 17th century, and the quotation itself isn't particularly illuminating. And because the spelling of the head word was ekphrasis with a C, and people on the website were searching it with a K, so this really hindered discoverability. And on the slide, you can see the revised version of ekphrasis, which has the most common spelling, and it has a definition which will actually help these students who will look it up in November with their essays, and then it has evidence right up to the present day. And as well as looking at behaviour on the website, we also take into account comments from users both on the OED and other dictionaries. So, for example, our current dictionary data is used by Google when you type into Google to find this. The dictionary box that comes up is the Oxford definition. And we're currently amending our definition of the word sectarian after a user commented to Google that our definition of denoting or concerning a sect or sects isn't really the best wording when it comes to find out what sectarian means when you talk about, for example, sectarian violence in Northern Ireland. And the OED had already identified sect and related words as a priority for revision. So an editor is currently working on them, and the revised entries will be published in June. And if it hasn't been corrected already, you'll see a revised version in the current dictionary as well for sectarian. And as we're now working a digital edition of the dictionary, as I mentioned earlier, space is no longer a constraint as it was for the first editors. So as a result, we've also, to make things better for users, we've expanded many of the opaque abbreviations we used, both in citations, but also throughout the dictionary. For example, FREQ, FREQ for frequently. We don't need to abbreviate that, we can say frequently. We've also made our definitions less truncated and telegraphic, so users really know what can really understand how a word is being used. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, another change from the first edition of the dictionary is editors' assumptions about the ideal user. And their ideal user was probably someone who was familiar with Latin and Greek, probably a Christian, probably from a Western background as a default. And that made some of the definitions seem either impenetrable or insensitive as a definition for heathen. So we now aim to write for a broader global audience, clearly and elegantly, and in which specialist knowledge is not assumed unless absolutely necessary. And my next slide just shows a revised definition for a sense of nod. And this is the sense which covers the expression even Homer nods or Homer nods. And the original entry just says, it's in Echoes of Horace, Ars Poet, Dormitat Homerus. And so you have to know what Horace is, what Dormitat Homerus is. So it's assuming you know Latin and are familiar with the Latin poet Horace. And below we have the revised entry where we explain the allusion. We give much more context, and we also translate the Latin itself so the user can trace a path from the use in the poetry of Horace to examples as shown in the quotations. And as well as acting on usage patterns and user feedback, we also solicit valuable language knowledge from users themselves. We also solicit valuable language knowledge from the public. And this can be in the form of one-off queries or more general appeals. So this slide shows when we decided to ask the public via Twitter what they think of when they hear the word dungarees. So as a British person, when I hear the word dungarees, I think of an item of clothing as shown in picture B on the slide, or picture E. And I would never even imagine that a dungarees could be anything else. But in the States, dungarees are often, when you say that word, you think of what's in picture A, for example, or picture C. And so we opened it up to the public. People from all across the world replied, and it became clear there was this split in what the word referred to. And the next slide shows the relevant senses after revision. And we've added in the notes information about the regional spread of these senses. So for example, in sense 3, we say the usual sense in British use, and in varieties of English close to British English, whereas sense B is US. And that we could confirm that information from asking users across the world what they understood by the word, because our own intuitions might not be correct if we're from a particular region. And we also have more general appeals. And these appeals have been in place since the very inception of the dictionary, the original crowdsourcing, where the dictionary editors asked members of the public to send in their words or help find examples of words. And in 2018, we had a very successful appeal in which we asked our users to submit words particular to their own town or region. And we called it Words Where You Are. And as you can see from the slide, people from all over the world submitted words that their regional words that were particular to them, whether it's words for alleyways, bread rolls. Someone from Michigan said here, a sliding glass door is called a door wall. And these appeals are really valuable because these types of regional words are difficult to find in more formal written contexts. And so the suggestions from the public were an invaluable starting point, and it resulted in drafting of several regional and world English items, as well as updates and amendments to existing entries. And you can read a lot more about this appeal on our website in various blog posts, and we can send the links on to that. So this was a whistle-stop tour of some aspects of OED revision and drafting. But as I mentioned earlier, I've only touched on one aspect of the work of the OED team. Besides revision and drafting new words, we are at work on many other projects designed to make the OED as useful as possible for researchers. For example, identifying the main current sense in an entry to make search results more accessible, linking to other dictionaries and texts, and exploring how we can computationally provide information about sense frequencies over time, for example. And we're also continuously updating the dictionary in light of changes in the wider world. For example, we've recently amended the definition of Elizabethan following the death of the Queen, tweaking definitions of marriage to reflect changing laws regarding the institution, and amending definitions to ensure that they are free of insensitivities, biases, and outdated cultural attitudes. And as I touched on, user feedback and user contributions are an important part of the OED project. So please do get in touch if you have any suggestions for improvements to entries or new words you'd like to bring to our attention.